Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel, and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. In our current moment in Zion's history, we're on a journey still to find a new lead pastor. And this is an exciting time, but also one that can raise a lot of questions and concerns. In this season in particular, we're asking some basic questions about what is a pastor? What makes a good one? Where do we find a new lead pastor? And what are some characteristics that they may have? Over the next few episodes and some of the previous ones now, we're looking at what we're calling pastor profiles. And in these, we're asking what pastors do and who are some good examples of this. And today in particular, we're looking at the pastor as a leader of the church in an ever-changing world. But before we dive in, hey Seth, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm doing pretty good. As I was walking over here, I saw someone and they asked how I was doing. I said, well, I'm about to go talk to Keaton Paul. And so that's a pretty good... It's a pretty good afternoon.
Is that a good afternoon?
That is a great afternoon for me.
I hope so. I mean, we don't believe in purgatory here, but some people might view it as like, this is penance. I have to talk to this guy. Hopefully not too many, but
absolutely not. I was like, this is going to make my afternoon significantly better.
These are great.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
I'm also just excited about what we're talking about. You sent me kind of some options as we're kind of going forward. You were like, which one do you want to talk about? And I said this topic and you said, I hoped that's what you would say. And I think it's just because like this is a topic kind of you and I both, I think a lot about how we relate to the culture as Christians.
Right. Yeah.
About how we engage with people and politics and art and, all of the things.
Right.
And so the people we're going to talk about today are influential either directly or indirectly on us a lot.
Right.
And so I'm excited to kind of dig into that with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm excited for this one too. So with that, like, here are just some just like basic difficulties. Okay. Leading a church and applying the gospel in an ever-changing world, just as a pastor, is a super overwhelming kind of thing. And I don't feel this pressure as much as some guys that I know do, but some guys I know almost feel the temptation to be omniscient. And you, especially with the massive amount of information that's just readily available to us at all points in time, it's so hard to try to keep up. And part of my daily routine is after I finished seminary, during seminary even, I don't think I had like any sort of awareness or regular rhythm to keep me current on events, because at that point in my life, my nose is in old books for several years because I want to be formed by the Bible and by people who have been formed by the Bible, and most of them are dead. And so I just want to stay there. And so for years and years and years, I did not have a practice of being even remotely aware of what was going on in the world. And I've changed that some, because because then I started teaching high schoolers, and you step into their world, and suddenly I'm using illustrations to try to communicate something, and they're like, "What are you saying?" we don't know what that reference is. And I'm like, you've never heard of Ferris Bueller? Like, what are you talking? What's wrong with you? I don't know. TikTok. I'm like, what's TikTok? So anyway, but that's part of it. Technology, and this is just a fact. Like, I think being a pastor today is truly, I think, one of the most difficult eras to be a pastor, especially in the Western world, simply because the massive exponential growth in technology has made our culture really the fastest changing culture in history.
Mm.
Um, every day, every year, there's some sort of new development is happening, and things that were true 10 years ago are just just almost faux pas, and you just shake your head and think, how did we do that just a few years ago? And uh, one thing I love to do is to think back, especially of like what was in vogue just in the culture and in the church like 20 years ago.
Mm. Yeah.
And we did some really hokey stuff back in the day. And like uh one thing that it was just such a weird kind of cultural phenomenon. Like the fashion was awful. Frosted tip hair was
I
terrible.
don't know. I could see that one coming
You
back. I could
see that one coming.
I think I could pull it off.
Oh
And
man.
Megan disagrees.
Yeah.
So I haven't gone down that road yet.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
Okay.
but I think what you're saying is really true. Where on kind of two fronts, as you're talking about that, is what I'm thinking about. Like I'm a little bit more on Instagram than you,
Yeah.
but even then, not much.
Yeah. Right.
And so I scroll sometimes and I'm like, oh, these trends that were like to me are brand new
Right.
are like 2 months old,
Right.
and the quickness
Yeah.
of the trends,
Yeah.
how fast everything changes and moves, and style of music changes, or
Yeah.
style of clothing changes, or fill in the blank, like whatever it is.
Right.
As we've been talking about kind of pastoral leadership and things, I've done some research, and
Yeah.
of course the algorithms then feed
Absolutely.
all of the things. And so I've seen a lot of like celebrity pastors.
Yeah.
And it's really funny to watch someone like Stephen Furtick, who, regardless what you think about his theology, you watch him over the years, and as you're watching him, you can see he's keeping up with all these trends, right? And whatever he's wearing or however he's styled at any given moment is probably like the hippest thing.
Right. Right.
But then you look at him just even like 10 years ago and you're like, you dressed like that, dude?
That's
like,
right.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Or even 5 years ago, like it feels like the speed of the trends.
Yeah.
Where, you could look at the 80s or the 90s.
Right.
And that's like a decade that you can kind of fit a box around. It's almost like even in the last 3 years of the 2020s, 4 years of the 2020s, you have to kind of like divide each year up.
You really do, yeah.
And I think that, to your point, the internet is kind of what's driving that, because something new can catch and get millions of views like that.
Right.
As opposed to, 100 years ago in the 1920s, where it's got to go all the way across the country and all the way back.
Right.
And, the forms of mass communication were just a lot slower.
Yeah. And just thinking on that, right. So one thing that, especially as I was growing up, a child of the 90s, which, to some people listening, that is like painful, what was happening in the 90s, whatever, to other people, probably not too many people, but to some people, at least listening to this, to some that seems really old. But one of the words that was just constant,
not to make you feel bad, but I only lived for about 4 months in the 90s.
Okay.
So
okay, yeah, that does make me feel bad.
Our age gap isn't apparent much, but only in times like this.
Only in times like this, whenever you throw stuff like But so one thing I heard growing up a lot reiterated was relevant in the church, and there was and it was interesting that kind of growing up that that was people weren't really pushing that. There've been trends in the church throughout the ages. In a lot of those are cultural, but from really the Second Great Awakening, I think 1800s in America, Charles Finney and that kind of group. There were some great guys in the Second Great Awakening. My humble opinion, Charles Finney was not one of the great guys in the Second Great Awakening, and I could go on a long soapbox as to why I really don't like Charles Finney. But anyway, besides the point. From that point on, there are a lot of like trends where people almost copy and paste what other guys are doing. It becomes way more pragmatic. And then throughout the 20th century, especially in America, there are a lot of very similar things. We're copying and pasting, similar trends in pragmatics of what's quote unquote effective. But there was something that happened in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s where kind of the coin term is relevance or contemporary, or one I I heard to kind of like make fun. It was almost 10 years after this whole movement, and there's like this weird nostalgia of saying, look at the weird stuff that we did. The term contemporant kind of squished those together. But in that, like, contextualization, a word that was kind of used in broader, almost missiological circles,
Right.
Somewhat became a bad word, because it almost became synonymous, not so much with contextualization, or what many might think of it as, but more as being pragmatic, just doing what works. If it gets people there and, you build the thing, whatever that may be, then do that. And so it became, and can be sometimes, a bad word, but it can also actually be a really, really good word,
Right.
I think.
Well, I think what you're hitting on there is that a lot of times within that search for relevance, there's usually some sort of a compromise
Yep, totally.
and or just a weakening in general,
Right.
because we want to draw you in.
Right.
And so we're not going to hit you with all the bad stuff yet and all the scary
Right.
stuff. We're
Right.
going to tell you the stuff that makes you feel good.
Yeah.
And that may be a little too pejorative,
Yeah.
a little too condescending, but like we're going to give you the stuff that's going to draw you in.
Right.
And then we're going to then we'll, in theory, we'll then bring out the big guns and
Right.
kind of go deep with the theology.
Yeah.
Attached to that, I think, is a lot of quote unquote being relevant was usually external things.
Yeah.
It was,
totally.
we're going to have cool music. We're going to have people who don't dress in robes and whatever. We're not going to have a choir. We're going to have a band. We're not going to. And within that is that contextualization piece.
Right.
That can be really good.
Yeah.
So one of the successes early on of Mark Driscoll and the Mars Hill movement.
Yeah.
Again, regardless of what you think about the theology and kind of the person of Mark Driscoll and that church and how that kind of ended.
Yeah.
Regardless of what you think about that, the initial success of that church was, we are going to be true to the gospel.
Yeah.
But do it in a way that is going to connect with the people that we're around.
Yeah, right.
Of course. And then I think that the story of that church demonstrates the kind of dual-sided nature of that, where you can then turn around and say, you're so obsessed with building the thing that you lose sight of the gospel. And I think that's where people, when they think of the term relevant specifically and relevant in America,
right,
especially, it becomes, relevant means this kind of program driven, people, number driven thing, as opposed to the truth of the gospel being presented in a way that will actually connect with people.
Right. Yeah. And so with that sort of thing, you had, almost kind of two poles. You had the one group that was purely pragmatic, kind of coming out of the seeker sensitive movement of Willow Creek,
Mm-hmm.
or what was the guy from the Crystal Cathedral? I can't remember his name, but like just very on that end to build that. And one of the objections, I think, to speak against it, people, you don't have to make the gospel relevant. The gospel is always relevant, and that's true, 100%. Believe that with all of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
The gospel is always relevant, but sometimes how you say gospel or how you apply the gospel changes it. And so instead of, because relevance or contextualization can, kind of set people off. I think leading the church in an ever-changing world, one of the things that has to be at the core of what we're doing is what I call gospel translation.
Oh yeah, that's a good word for it.
And it's necessary for us to do, right? Because we're all for having our Bibles in a language that we understand, and we should be for that. Very few people in church history have known Greek, and even fewer have known Hebrew. And so, to pick up your Bible in the original language means virtually nothing to most people. And so the constancy of having to do updated Bible translation, just as an example, it is something that is a wonderful thing we should be given to. The same thing is true though with the word that's there as we preach it, of taking God's word but applying it to the world in which the people that are in our congregations live. And so it's always necessary for the church to do the work of ministry that is specific to their culture in every age. And so that's why I call it gospel translation, but that's partly because I'm a biblical language nerd. And I think that's communicating what I see really effective pastors over the past really 30 years have done, is taken the gospel and in their specific communities, in their specific contexts, they've translated that gospel, that good news message, not in generalities or Christianese, as sometimes it's called,
Mm-hmm.
but they're actually doing it in a way that people are going, bam, okay, wait, no, that struck a chord, and that guy, if nothing else, he understands the world that I live in, and the fact that this pastor here gets how my life looks, and now is saying, this is something that you're longing for because you're doing these things right. Well, Jesus is actually what you're looking for. And I think that's something that's happening.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about some people who do this well and a few other things. I want to add one thing to the kind of the relevance conversation, is that the guys that we're going to talk about who do this well, and the way that it's done well, is that it never, I think a lot of people don't like the word relevant because usually when they're trying to be relevant, it rings false.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's this, I think at least the image in my head is like the hokey youth pastor trying to like create a series out of TikTok trends or something on Wednesday nights. And the problem with that is that it doesn't ring true to the people to the kids who are hearing it. They're like, oh, I know that you don't get what you're talking about. You're just trying to force these two things together that don't fit.
Yeah, right.
Rather than speaking to me on the level that I do understand and I do get.
Right.
And so I think that gospel translation, what's so important about it is that just like almost really any work of translation, when you're connecting the two groups, it helps to have somebody who is intimately familiar with the culture.
Right.
You would probably not do well trying to lead a church in New York City.
Nope.
Because you are in Mount Pleasant,
Yep.
ag major.
Yep.
And that's fine. Like
Right.
that's totally fine. But someone who is intimately familiar with the culture of New York City
Right.
can come in and say, I'm familiar, I'm steeped in the gospel culture. I'm intimately familiar with this gospel culture.
Right.
And I'm familiar with the culture of New York City. And so
Right.
I can connect the two.
Yeah.
And that's what it takes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And and kind of keeping that in mind, one distinction that I think, because we're having to translate the gospel uh into our daily culture. And this is one of the beauties of the Christian faith. It is that um it's, for lack of a better term, contextualizable.
Mm.
Um just think of its origin. What is Christianity? Christianity, it is a Middle Eastern religion formed around a Jewish rabbi who was crucified by Roman captives. Um, and so like that world, which is the starting point of our, and I think we can use the word religion, and that's not a bad word. Sometimes people use it as a bad word. It's not a bad word. Um, the start of our religion is a vastly different culture than the world that we live in. And so one of the things that theologians have talked about with the nature of Christianity and its kind of contextualization is the difference between form and essence. Um, there are certain things that are essential to the Christian faith. The fact that we worship a triune God, one God, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That the second person of the Trinity is the eternal Son of God, begotten from the Father before all ages, but took on flesh and dwelt among us, took to himself a true body and a reasonable soul, died on a cross, was risen from the dead 3 days later, ascended into heaven, and is now seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. These things that are historic creeds have really condensed for us that we can kind of carry around. These are real. These are the largely the essence of the Christian faith, but the form or forms in which that essence is practiced, it is shapeable and changeable. And so just a fact, the way that the early church worshipped probably looks different than the way a lot of churches today worship. Even the way that we worship, and so that's okay. Even though Zion's liturgy is based on 16th and 17th century Reformed liturgies, but notice we're not speaking in Latin or French or German or even British English. We're speaking modern southeastern United States, largely English, and the application is very different. We talked about this before in kind of the nature of preaching. If you look at the sermons of some early church father and one of the reformers and a Puritan, they look very different from ours. But they have the essence of the Christian faith, but the form is different. Even our, some of our aesthetics, our tune selection, for the songs that we sing are different. This is an interesting fact that I don't think many people know. You know, people love hymns and psalms of the faith, and hear me when I say this. Me too. I love my Trinity hymnal. It is so good. It is brilliant. The work that they put into that is fantastic. I love it. But sometimes we almost get hung up on, don't change my hymn, and don't do something like change the tune to make it more singable for a particular people in a particular culture. But fun thing, Calvin's Geneva, they sang psalms mostly, if not exclusively, but they regularly changed the tunes to what had historically been sung, and a lot of them were like folk songs, or songs songs that honestly you would you and your buddies as you're getting together in 16th century Geneva after watching the game together, and you're closing out the night, you want to sing one more farewell song. It's you buy the boys around and you sing together. They called them Genevan jigs because they were so lively, that they were like, that some people thought they were, irreverent during that particular time. And now we listen to them and some people think that they're, wildly stodgy, because they're slow and sometimes minor, in minor keys. But all that to say, like, one thing that the church has done throughout the culture is we sing songs that to tunes that resonate with our particular culture. Wonderful, faithful Orthodox Presbyterian churches in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The songs that they sing are really biblical, but the tunes that they sing them to are different than ours. Right. And in Africa and Southeast Asia, all of these, they're very different in the tune, and that's acceptable. That's okay. And they should, the stylings should match the culture of the people that they're in. And again, this is one of the really, really unique aspects of Christianity. Other world religions don't do this. They're stuck to the culture in which they're founded, and they can't be contextualized. And so this is actually a beautiful thing about Christianity, not only in the nature of our worship and discipleship, but it has something to say even about evangelism too. How we share the gospel with our neighbors has to be contextualized, or how you talk to people in general, it constantly has to be contextualized. And but part of this is having, as we've talked about a lot before, feet in both worlds, the biblical world, and the world of our day, or to use what you used a minute ago, the gospel culture, and the culture of whatever city you live in, and that can be a challenge. And so having a pastor who is able to model that for you in the way that they preach, in their conversation, in the way that they do evangelism, in the way that they teach and disciple the people and counsel, is pretty vital. And if you have somebody that has one leg in a particular world more so than the other, then it ends up being unbalanced. And so you really have to have both, and it be a really balanced effort.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to one of the things, just to kind of draw this big circle. We talked a lot about the importance of the pastor as a shepherd.
Yeah.
And the pastor is somebody who knows the people. It is impossible to properly apply the gospel to a particular group in a particular culture if you don't know the culture and you don't know the people. And that doesn't mean that every pastor needs to be a TikTok influencer. It just means that, like, there's a culture in Columbia, Tennessee. There's a culture at Zion Presbyterian Church. There's a culture in Murray County. And if you don't know those cultures, if you don't understand how people relate to one another and what matters to them, because what matters to the people of Columbia, Tennessee is different than what matters to the people of Franklin, Tennessee.
Right.
And that's different than what matters to the people of Dixon, Tennessee. It's like, you can't even just say, well, the state of Tennessee is like this.
Right.
Which I think we all kind of know inherently. And so you have to have somebody who knows this is how to communicate with this particular group of people.
Yeah.
And that is constantly changing. I mean, you've lived here your whole life. Like, like the culture of Columbia is very different now than it was when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's different, and you have to being on the, not cutting edge is like, that's pretty dramatic. But being up on like what's happening
Yeah.
and what matters to people is incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, here are I'm going to go like just briefly through and give some examples of people in very, very different cultures who have done this well. First and foremost, I think even to this day, still somewhat of a model of how to contextualize. Is probably not somebody that people just like automatically think of. But Augustine
Mm.
was a master, an absolute master at doing what we're talking about here, leading the church in an ever changing world. And his years are 354 to 430 AD, and he lived in a world of massive transition. Um, it, to the point like it's historians will tell you when you try to give like hard dates for this era ended this date, it is somewhat of a generalization, and will probably get you raked over the coals in academic settings. But there is a sense in which even in scholarly uh, you know historic works to say Augustine lived in a world in transition that was moving from the ancient world to what we call the medieval world, was definitely happening in a tangible way to where as Augustine is finishing out his life, he's able to look at the world around him and go, yeah, we're entering into a new age. I know this to be fact, and we're able to know that just because of his writings. But what he does so well is he's able to capture, in one sense, the universality of the human heart and the human longing. Um, he does this brilliantly in his confessions, and his insights constantly into the human heart have resonated with people since Augustine's time, and it's been in any great works, Western Civ, Western philosophy course at any major universities, you're gonna hit Augustine and you're gonna talk about his confessions, just because what he put his finger on is something that people have wrestled with from even before his time. um, you know, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, as he prays to the Lord, and that restlessness of the human heart really is a universal thing that every you can apply it in any culture at any point in any time. Everybody that you've ever encountered it is longing for something. They've got an itch that they just can't quite scratch. Um, and Augustine is great at just delving into what can sometimes feel like bruises and or really sore muscles almost to like get in there and say, yeah, this is the muscle that's hurting right now. And you're just hurting yourself more by trying to use this idol, whether it be riches or power or influence or fame or whatever else. You're just hurting yourself more, because this hurt muscle is something that everybody experiences, and there's only one solution, and it's Jesus. And so he's able to do really well to find those universal principles that are never changing, steeped in Scripture, a rich awareness of the human fallen condition, which he preaches till he's blue in the face. That is it's a universal condition. We're all totally depraved. Studying Paul, he does that well. But at the same time, so that's Confessions. But his second most famous work, he's doing something very different in his City of God. While in the Confessions, he's addressing the human condition in a universal sense, and it hits everybody, as a condition that we are all experiencing. He's in the City of God giving a model and addressing the culture of his day, but in doing so, addressing the Roman world that's crumbling before his very eyes, and engaging with that and saying, there really are there's the city of this world and there's the city of God, and the city of this world that I'm living in, it's this, and people are looking to these deities and these philosophies, and they don't deliver, but the city of God does, and the city of God endures forever. And so he's doing this brilliant work of very specific, contextualized um, gospel translation into his world, to where, even very recent works that we'll talk about a little bit later are basically saying, yeah, I'm not really doing anything new or innovative. I'm actually just copying what Augustine did. The application just looks a little bit different. But the model is the same. And so again, that component of understanding the human heart well, understanding the Bible well, but also understanding the culture in which you live, having that trifecta almost is what good contextualization looks like. And I think Augustine really is a model for us, kind of going forward. But another one, on that, to fast forward, get a little bit closer to who we are. Another person that I think is doing so in a different way, a similar thing to Augustine, but in a different way, is Martin Luther. 1483 to 1546. The in some cases people call him the father of the Reformation. But in some sense, and I've heard this from various scholars, there is this reality of Luther is the last medieval man or the first modern man. One of the two. He lives in both. And what Luther does brilliantly, is in this world of just massive transition from the medieval world into the modern world, the huge technological developments of the day, the development of the middle class and the mercantile system, the printing press changes everything, absolutely everything. And then, consequently, Reformation happens, and now, things are just very different. But few characteristics about Luther that some people, I don't think, always take into account. This first one they do: bold convictions, like very bold convictions. You don't have to read much Martin Luther to go, yeah, he believes what he's saying. But another thing about Luther that I don't think people recognize was his brilliant use of the medium of the day. He was either personally or impersonally, either way you cut it, his work was constantly going to the printing press and like mass producing his works, and the works of his day, and was very devoted in getting good resources into the hands of the common people of the day. And what better way to do it than via this brand new technology, the printing press. And so people now are able to have, these great works of theology in their hands, these tracts, which, gospel tracts, what we think of today, is a little bit different then, but he's using the medium of the day. But then finally, he's got this ability to literally translate the gospel into the everyday language. The Luther Bible, he takes gets his doctorate in New Testament from the University of Wittenberg, and then spends time learning Hebrew, and does the massive work of translating the Bible into the common everyday German of his day. And in German, the Luther Bible is the King James Version. Like, to this day, people still prefer, oftentimes, the Luther Bible over against some of the modern German translations, because he did a great job translating it, but especially in the German of his day, is like, this is what how the common people speak, and the idioms and the grammar and the syntax and the word usage, very much to the common person. And that conviction, I think, aside from his boldness and, just the providence of God, um, is a huge part as to why the Reformation was as successful as it was. And then third, finally, even closer to us now, I think one of the greats who has done this, better than most was Francis Schaeffer. Um, Anybody who knows me pretty well knows that I love Francis Schaeffer and have spent a lot of time reading him, especially recently, his years 1912 to 1984. But he too lived in a world of massive transition from really the modern world, post-Enlightenment world, into really the postmodern world. And his story is so fascinating. He was a part of, gets converted later on, wasn't really raised in a Christian home, gets converted late in high school, goes and joins Machen for a year and is at Westminster Seminary. And Westminster, there was a split in Westminster, and there was a group that were like, yeah, um, there's almost there's a real caricature towards fundamentalism that, is not a great thing. And in the day, Westminster was a fundamentalist school. And some people still think that today. I love Westminster Seminary. My wife goes there, so this is not dogging Westminster Seminary. Love it. But the group that Schaeffer ran with was like, yeah, Westminster's not fundamentalist enough. And so there's a split with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and Westminster Seminary to form the Bible Presbyterian Church and Faith Seminary. And he goes with that group and is very steeped in the fundamentalist tradition, which generally is not very good at what we're talking about. If there is a mark of being, of not contextualizing well and being combative, pure combative to the culture that you live in, it's the fundamentalism. Well, at some point, Schaeffer ends up in Europe, post-war Europe, for the denomination to be a missionary. Finds himself in Switzerland and has a massive crisis of faith, to where like he just has to he totally and completely deconstructs, to use a modern word, completely and utterly deconstructs and says, I have to totally rebuild my faith. And so he really does, dependence on the Spirit from the ground up, wrestles through his quote unquote deconstruction. And out of that comes this passion to winsomely and very robustly, but also deeply biblically speak truth into the culture of his day. And so, L'Abri, if you know the Schaeffer story, L'Abri becomes this this small mountain kind of cabin where college kids from all across the globe who are struggling with the faith just find ways, hitchhike across Europe, backpack across Europe to stay with the Schaeffers at L'Abri for a week, a month, a year, and just sit and listen to Schaeffer. And Schaeffer's whole model was we give honest answers to honest questions. And in doing so, what he's doing, on steeped in the Word of God, relying on the Holy Spirit, he does what we've talked about before, what Daniel Strange, a current scholar, calls subversive fulfillment. He's entering into their world. He's asking good questions. He's listening well. He's exploring around, trying to see, okay, what's actually behind this question, and then he's exposing, or what we talked about before, of kind of the prophetic witness of speaking in culture, with culture, and against culture, all simultaneously. I'm using language that you understand. I'm understanding the world that you live in, but I want to see you you live life biblically, which is true life. And so because of that, I've got to speak against the idols that are there. And so he's doing this, I think, brilliantly. And tons and tons of people were converted in a very grassroots movement, just because he was able to do both, all the while having his uncompromising conviction for the truth of God's word, or what he called true truth. In doing so in just a really highly contextualized way that's very faithful to Scripture. And so those three, I think, are really models throughout the ages of people who have done this really effectively. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many through lines through these three guys.
Yeah.
But the two things that really stood out to me as you're kind of running through all of them, and I'm more familiar with Augustine and Martin Luther actually than Francis Schaeffer, even though Francis Schaeffer is the most recent guy on this list.
Yeah.
But from even what I know about Francis Schaeffer, all three of these guys they're not dumb and ignorant about the technology that surrounds them. Right. So one of the things, so as someone who has a more technical ability, filmmaking background, I care about media, I care about those things. I've read a lot about the way that people talk about technology now.
Yeah.
And basically there's two camps that I think are kind of two extremes.
Yeah.
And there's the side on one side that says we shouldn't be involved on the internet. It's the problem. It's not the solution. We need to get away from it. Yeah. And then there's this kind of other camp that says this is the greatest technological revolution since the printing press, which I think is true.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to go all in.
Yeah.
And it becomes that kind of seeker sensitive, we're kind of leaning back into that. And so but what these guys are doing, and this gets kind of into the second thing that stood out to me, is that they're balancing that biblical faithfulness and saying, okay, how do I communicate this idea of biblical faithfulness in a way that connects with the culture that I'm seeing and I've experienced? And I think that the Francis Schaeffer honest answers to honest questions is huge. Because people can smell dishonesty from a mile away.
Oh yeah, especially like millennials and Gen Zers. That's one thing like that I'm really encouraged by, and I've told students time and time again, like I'm so glad that you're sick of people trying to sell you stuff, and that y'all can maybe not literally, but like fake. You can smell it a mile away,
right?
And that's actually encouraging to me.
But even that, like I think that Martin Luther, and Augustine are both doing the same thing.
Yeah,
and what they're doing is they are, to use this word again, deconstructing the artifice around everything.
Yeah, right.
And saying, let's get back to the roots of it, and say, and say what is actually biblically true. And that, it's what Martin Luther does with the Reformation, which he inadvertently started.
Right.
And it's what Francis Schaeffer is obviously doing, where he's saying, I'm going to take apart all this fundamentalism.
Right.
And he takes it apart. He finds Jesus and he goes back to the center of it. And that's what we have to do.
Right.
And I think that you're seeing this cycle, and it's a cycle because it's kind of, I think, in our human hearts to build things and to build towers of Babel for ourselves.
Totally.
And so this may be too much of a tangent, but like when we talk about the deconstruction movement that is happening now, I think we have to be aware of the fact that a lot of this is people smelling fake.
Yeah.
And saying this isn't, I need to get back to the root of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. When contextualization became the gospel, and the artifice became the essence, that's the fakeness that they're smelling. And what these guys are doing is saying, the point is not the contextualization. Um, the point is the unchanging word of God and the unchanging gospel, uh, but meeting them where they're actually at. And so, not being afraid to say, um, yeah, this thing that had become, so it was a tool for contextualization, and it became so core to who we were that this almost really became the gospel itself. Not being afraid to say, yeah, that's just not the gospel, and that's not the
Mm-hmm.
Bible, and that that was maybe a helpful thing at some point in addressing an issue of a day, um, but it's not now. And what do we really need? We need the gospel. And how do we get it? The unchanging word of God. And so, on that note, with these three, there are probably more, but I was thinking, and I came up with like 5 or so characteristics that each of them have, and I think these 5 things are really are 5 characteristics that faithful pastors are modeling themselves, but also teaching their people to do. And so, first and foremost is biblical faithfulness. Anytime anything in the church that happens that at its core is not seeking to be faithful to the Bible is always going to go awry. And so, that's maybe one of our kind of contextualization things is the deconstruction movement. And at its very core, one of the issues I think can be when deconstruction happens for deconstruction's sake, is, well, I deconstruct on the Bible. Well, now you've missed the essence altogether, and you're going to have a lot of other questions that you're going to have to deal with. That maybe actually now it's the culture driving you instead of what is the transcendent Word of God. So biblical faithfulness is vital. But another thing that all of these guys had was doctrinal depth. And so sometimes when we think of contextualization or relevance or whatever else, um, people almost assume that it means lowest common denominator,
Mm.
or almost a reductionistic faith. None of these guys have a reductionistic faith or are shooting for a lowest common denominator necessarily. Obviously, Augustine has some very particular Augustine-isms, and we're thankful for that. When he writes against the Donatists, on the nature of the sacraments and the nature of the church, that's great for us. But he had to have deep doctrinal convictions and depth, or else those things wouldn't come out. The same with his engagement with Pelagius. Obviously, Luther is very Luther, sometimes maybe too Luther, and Schaeffer too. A faithful, unapologetic Presbyterian in a postmodern world, which in my mind sounds awesome. Like that's that's really cool, and so he's got all of these kids that tons and tons of Ivy Leaguers are showing up at his doorstep. A recently retired professor of apologetics at Westminster Seminary, Bill Edgar, who I think is, especially in what we're talking about today, is as good as it gets in a very academic way, was a student at Harvard and raised in a largely atheist, happy atheist family, and had a friend at Harvard who said, "Hey, you need to check out this Schaeffer guy in Switzerland." And Edgar's dad was a very successful businessman, it seems. I think in Paris at the time, or somewhere close to there. It was in the continent. And on his trip, he stops by L'Abri to just kind of hear from Schaeffer and gets converted, right? Like, and so anyway, but all the while, Schaeffer he's very Presbyterian. He's got these doctrinal convictions, that he doesn't apologize. He doesn't apologize for the Westminster Confession of Faith. He just doesn't. He believes it and thinks it's coherent, and I think that's important. All of them also have a very strong conviction for truth, though. To use the biblical language of speaking the truth in love is something that they were committed to do. They believe strongly that what they're saying is true, and they wouldn't apologize for what they believe is true. But they do so, winsomely and lovingly for their neighbor. They all have a cultural awareness. They're able to speak into their culture in very careful, precise ways that I think we should model. And then finally, there's a deep understanding of the human heart, and a lot of work has been done from this. But I'll throw a pitch out to a book. We can put it in the show notes. Daniel Strange is Making the Faith Magnetic, who he is one of the leaders, I think, in kind of in doing this very thing well today. Younger scholar in the UK. But in that book, he gives kind of 5 magnetic points that that all cultures have, but then he gives specifics for our culture today in it. And I would run down those magnetic points, but I don't want to spoil the book. He's taking that, actually, one of the guys that we love around here, theologian named Herman Bavinck. Just recently, he was a late 19th, early 20th century Dutch Reformed scholar. Wrote probably my favorite systematic theology, 4 volumes, Reformed Dogmatics. He had a nephew, interestingly enough, who was he studied missions and evangelism, J.H. Bavinck, who we're somewhat rediscovering now, and he's actually kind of taking from that. So again, there are two or three others who are doing this thing well, the 2 Bavincks and Dan Strange. But there's this rich understanding of the human heart. So taking all of those components, those 5 things of biblical faithfulness, doctrinal depth, strong conviction for truth, cultural awareness, and an understanding of the human heart, all of those things, all of these are doing well. And there are a lot of people who do this well who you don't know because they're out doing it. They're practitioners.
Well, and I'll add, if I can just add one thing there. They have a proper prioritization of these things, which I think is huge. They're grounded in that biblical faithfulness.
You're right.
And they have the doctrinal depth.
Yeah.
But it doesn't overtake their biblical faithfulness.
Right.
Their cultural awareness doesn't take over the doctrinal depth or the faithfulness. Their conviction for truth does not outweigh understanding the human heart, which I would pair with loving your neighbor.
Right.
Their loving their neighbor doesn't outweigh their doctrinal depth or their biblical faith. It's all in the proper priority, which I think is really, really important for both their effectiveness and the reason that they have lasted.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that balance is so hard to walk. It's just really difficult. And so, maybe, we can kind of look at this. Somebody who I think has not only been a student of all of these guys that we've talked about, but been a brilliant practitioner of this very thing is Tim Keller. Mm-hmm. Dear brother in the faith, recently went to be with the Lord, PCA, teaching elder, faculty member at RTS, New York. He not only did all of these things well as a practitioner, but really developed a lot of the thinking for how to do this in a day-to-day model going forward. And so just listen to a Tim Keller sermon, and I'm sitting there listening. Trying to listen fairly regularly to one of his sermons every now and then, and just because I appreciate his stuff so much. And the whole time I'm going, he's hitting a point that as somebody who went to New York City once in high school, and probably stuck out like a sore thumb because there I am, in like Wranglers and boots walking down Broadway. Like it was, yeah, like Jed Clampett, walking into some really bougie restaurant in Little Italy or something like that. Oh yeah, can I get the whatever that thing is, right? But so somebody that's like pretty far removed from New York City, and he's addressing things that you know really do apply to where I am, while also going, yeah, I don't, he's also addressing, probably your average NYU student
Mm-hmm.
in that moment,
Yeah.
or your average, um, you know, um, executive from Wall Street, right? Like he's doing both of those things in just a way to where you can kind of sit down and go, if you recognize what he's doing, to just sit and kind of marvel for a minute and think, how is he doing that? Um, and taking the Bible and unfolding it, and it's hitting me, who's very much not an executive from Wall Street, but also still hitting the executive from Wall Street. Um, and I think part of that, points to the sheer beauty of the Bible that Keller, held in such high regard. But also, a lot of the indwelling of the Spirit there for sure. But also a lot of work and careful analysis of the Bible, of theological convictions, but also of his own culture and the city that he lived in. And so, I'm just so thankful for he and men like him, who've modeled it well.
Yeah, he really just had his finger on the pulse in a way that I think is incredibly unique.
Yeah.
Generation, all of these guys,
Yeah,
really
right.
just being able to have that unique convergence of those five things,
Yeah.
and in a way that, especially someone like Tim Keller was not trying to call attention to himself.
Right.
He just
Right.
did it exceptionally well.
Yeah. Right.
So I have two kind of closing questions.
Yeah.
The first is like, as a local pastor,
Right.
right? You're not like in a global kind of position. You're not, obviously we're on a podcast, but you're not like an influencer out there in the world writing books and everything. How do you see your role as a pastor to
Yeah.
engage the culture in this way?
Yeah. That's great. Um, it, One, I do a few things. One, I I am pretty intentional with my reading. Obviously, I want to know about the things out there. Um, and to kind of put a little even tweak on that too. Not only, I'm a local church pastor, but also, I'm a a high school Bible teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and so very regularly, sometimes painfully, um, I love to tune in basically when students say, "Hey, I'm watching this show right now. You should watch it too." Almost always I'll watch it, the
Yep.
whole thing. Um, and most of the time it's painful. They're awful. Like they're so bad. you know. Um, uh, but I watch it cuz I that story is compelling to them,
Mm.
and those characters, there's something about the characters, and regularly what I'm able to see is like, um you know that is actually their version of redemption, but the Bible offers a far better version, and actually the true version of redemption. This whole character is a quasi messianic figure who delivers themselves from their own sin, and their own self actualization as the story unfolds. They're looking for that. Okay, well, I can grab that, and because that was compelling to them, and say, actually, there's a better truth than even what the story was proclaiming. So I do that. A lot of the times when students are like, "Yeah, I'm going to this person's concert," I'll listen to it, right? Like, even if that is not my music taste at all. Okay, I have shamefully, or not. I don't know. Uh, you know, kind of sort of become a Swiftie, as they say.
No shame.
Well,
No shame.
it's not I'm more of a Merle Haggard guy by nature. But I've listened to a lot of Taylor Swift's music, and it's provided, she's a great storyteller.
Right.
And she tells the story of kind of the cultural narrative that, particularly teenage girls are living in. And so that's been super helpful. Olivia Rodrigo is another one that I'm like, even though I'm not, that's not my general genre, I'm tuning in. So that's one thing that I do. But I think another thing that, pastors and not just pastors, Christians should do is just listen to their kids and their neighbors well, right? Sharing the gospel is a part of the mission that Jesus calls us to. That's true. But sometimes in order to do that effectively, you do have to spend time listening. And so, there is almost the for lack of a better term, the lost art of Christian listening, to where you without having kind of your evangelism gun loaded, and you invite your neighbor over to have dinner or for coffee or whatever, and you bring your gun, and now that you've got them here and you've paid for their coffee and they have to sit and listen, you get to fire both barrels. There is something to be said about just sitting and listening to the cares and the concerns and the burdens and the longings of the heart of your pagan neighbor. Sometimes without maybe even saying the word Jesus, but you've got to take in where they are, and actually listen, and do what I've mentioned Stott several times, but John Stott calls double listening. You're listening truly to where they are, but you're also listening for redemptive themes. I can hit that point. Okay, that's a redemptive theme. They're longing to be delivered. Okay, I see that. I understand it. I'm asking good questions, and so those are two things that I really strive to do. Read, take in the media of the day, but also mainly through just good conversation.
And then if someone were to ask you,
Mm-hmm.
who are you listening to? Who are you reading? What are you reading? And not necessarily in a totally pastoral context,
Right.
necessarily. It doesn't have to be, I guess.
Yeah.
But like, who are you paying attention to that you feel like has their finger on the pulse? I mean, I have people that I like to listen to, but who do you listen to?
Yeah. So most of the time, especially some of this, taking the gospel and bringing it to where people are, oftentimes just kind of the way it works, it starts more in academic settings and then trickles down to more practical. And so I think two guys in kind of the more academic world, that are younger guys, but I think their works are very practical, and are really kind of setting the tone, and getting tools into the hand of everyday Christians to do this well too. In particular, the first is Christopher Watkin. He's a Brit, lives in Australia. Recently wrote a book. Don't let the title freak you out. Biblical Critical Theory. It's a scary title, but it's really, really good. And he just kind of opens up. He's a philosopher by trade, and he opens up the book to basically say, what Augustine was doing in the City of God. I'm taking generally that model, and I'm just applying it to everyday matters. He has some kind of newer developments. I don't think he gives himself enough credit for for his originality in certain regards. But he's one guy that I'm really, I'm looking at, I'm listening to a lot, because he does this really, really well in a very difficult world. I mean, he's a philosophy professor in Australia, which is pretty post-Christian.
Yeah.
Doing that incredibly well. Another one I've mentioned before, Daniel Strange, written a few different books that are very accessible. One I just recently read was Making the Faith Magnetic, which I just mentioned. We'll put a link in the show notes. Anybody can pick that book up. Biblical critical theory is 600 something pages. It's not super dense, but it is fairly technical. We can put that in the show notes too. If you're looking for a challenge, like that probably is one. Making the Faith Magnetic is 160 pages or so. So it's shorter, but really, really easy to read, formatted really well. So those are two guys, and just a lot of the development recently. There's been this massive resurgence in kind of what's known as the neo-Calvinist movement. The two guys in particular who kind of are the fathers of that are Abraham Kuyper and who we've mentioned before, Herman Bavinck. Those two guys, big kind of surge in how those guys thought theologically, and a term that gets applied to them, a biblical world and life view is. So that's more in the academic world, and kind of on the practical side of things. The Gospel Coalition has so many things that are super helpful, but recently they just launched the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. And there are tons of resources in there that are doing this really, really well, and that I really appreciate. And then one final guy, as far as cultural analysis and cultural insight, his stuff's great. Some of his theology is a little bit wonky, but so there's my, caveat. So don't be like, everything this guy says is, Keaton takes his gospel. That's not true. But his insights into culture are really good. His name's Mark Sayers, another Aussie. He really has his finger on the pulse of the culture of our day and some of the trends that are happening in just like really interesting ways. So I've found his work in addressing kind of bigger kind of cultural insight questions just really helpful for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that wraps us up
for
today. So next time we'll be back with more pastor profiles.
Yes, I think we have like one or two more pastor profiles, and we'll be concluding the season, and we'll take a little break in November or December, and then probably have stuff rolling out in January.
So if you have any questions for us to answer here, you can email those to keaton.paul@pcazion.org. Keaton, it's a pleasure as always.
As always.